She thought she was untouchable until the restaurant's owner stepped in with a lesson money couldn't buy. The evening rush at Donovan's, a high-end restaurant in San Diego, was at its peak, and there was a tangible sense of sophistication swirling through the air. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing prisms of light across polished wooden tables, each one meticulously set with crisp white linens, gleaming silverware, and a single tea-light candle that flickered gently. Soft jazz notes, punctuated by the occasional chatter of patrons, completed the ambience. Waiters moved with precision, balancing trays of colorful, exquisitely plated dishes, their rubber-soled shoes whispering against the Italian marble floor. Every detail had been carefully orchestrated to create an atmosphere of refined elegance, from the plush seating to the hushed conversations unfolding at each table. In the midst of this refined clamor sat a group of 3 women, their voices rising occasionally above the lull of tinkling glass and subdued laughter. At the head of the group was Evelyn Monroe, a woman who radiated a polished sort of power. Evelyn was not merely wealthy, she wore her affluence like a second skin. An imposing diamond necklace glittered at her neckline, and a watch with a face encrusted in tiny gems peeked out from beneath the cuff of her fitted blazer. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped impatiently against the stem of her wine glass, her gaze sweeping the room as if she were an empress appraising her court. At Donovan's, everything had its own pecking order, and Evelyn firmly believed she was perched at the very top. Yet, despite her commanding presence, there were smaller stories unfolding across the restaurant, stories she barely noticed or cared about. At the far end of the room, a slender waitress named Emily was making her way through the maze of tables, weaving around chairs and sidestepping other servers with a practiced, if tired, grace. Her name tag was nearly lost against the dark fabric of her uniform, but her youthful features betrayed her nervous determination. Working double shifts for weeks to save up for college, she had learned how to maintain an outward calm even as her body cried for rest. Tonight, though, fatigue pressed down a little harder on her shoulders. She stumbled slightly while depositing a tray of water glasses at a nearby table, and Evelyn, ever watchful for imperfections, took note. A small smirk tugged at the corner of Evelyn's mouth, as if she found confirmation of her assumptions, that certain people existed to serve and fail. The real trouble began shortly afterward, when Emily approached Evelyn's table, balancing 3 elaborate entree plates that gleamed under the ambient lighting. With a polite, if tremulous smile, Emily said, "Here you are, ladies. I hope you enjoy your meals," placing the plates one by one before the trio. The tension rippling through her was palpable. She was keenly aware that Evelyn was already eyeing her, ready to pounce. Sure enough, Evelyn's sculpted brow arched, and her eyes traveled with laser focus to the steak on her plate. "Excuse me," she said, her tone slicing through the casual hum of the restaurant. "Is this supposed to be medium rare? It looks far too cooked to me. And it's taken forever for this to arrive. How do you expect people to enjoy their evening when the service is this slow?" A few nearby guests paused mid-bite, glancing over with a flicker of curiosity or disapproval. Emily swallowed hard, her composure wavering. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Let me fix this right away," she said, reaching to lift the plate. "Spare me the apology," Evelyn barked, cutting her off. Her friends, clearly entertained, shared knowing grins. It's really not complicated to get an order right, unless you're incompetent. Emily's face blazed with humiliation, but she held her head up, refusing to let tears surface. From across the room, a man in a neatly tailored gray suit watched the scene unfold, his expression impassive, yet his focus unwavering. Carrying Evelyn's plate back toward the kitchen, Emily felt the grip of despair tightening around her heart. She'd endured a fair share of difficult customers, but there was something uniquely cruel about Evelyn's delivery, a knife-edge style of contempt that belittled its target in the most public way possible. At the kitchen doors, Emily paused. Her reflection in the small circular window revealed flushed cheeks and eyes that shimmered with the threat of tears. She inhaled slowly, calming herself before stepping into the organized chaos of the kitchen. The clang of pots and the sizzle of pans momentarily drowned out her own thoughts, letting her regain a fraction of her composure. Back at Evelyn's table, the scathing remarks continued, bolstered by the snickering approval of her 2 companions. "Did you notice the way she walked? Like she was about to drop everything," Evelyn quipped with a smirk, rolling her eyes for added effect. If she can't handle a place like this, she should just work at a drive-through window. Honestly, I'm shocked they'd hire someone so clearly out of her depth. Around them, other diners exchanged uncomfortable glances. Some shook their heads, others whispered quietly among themselves. Still, Evelyn's booming self-assurance shielded her from any sense of decorum. She enjoyed making scenes, or so it seemed, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Yet the man in the gray suit at the corner table remained silent, observing carefully, noting every barb and reaction. Moments later, Emily returned with a freshly prepared steak, placing it gently in front of Evelyn. "I had the chef remake this for you, ma'am. I hope it's to your satisfaction now." Her voice was soft, wobbly with a residue of anxiety, but still polite. Evelyn barely glanced at the dish before shrugging. "We'll see," she said dismissively. "Next time, try to get it right the first time. And do stand up straighter. You look like you're about to melt into the floor." Despite the humiliations, Emily only managed to faint, "Yes, ma'am," and hurried away, eager to avoid further confrontation. The toxic atmosphere was briefly interrupted by the clink of silverware and the hum of hushed conversations as Emily left. Evelyn leaned in, regaling her friends with anecdotes from her latest vacation, detailing lavish spa treatments and private villas. "Absolutely stunning," she gushed, swirling her wine. "The staff was flawless. Nothing like what we've seen tonight." Her friends giggled in agreement, feeding off the high of being in Evelyn's social orbit. Little did they realize, a silent observer was already taking steps to alter the course of their evening. Standing discreetly at the bar, the restaurant's manager, an older gentleman with salt and pepper hair and kind but discerning eyes, spoke in hushed tones with a man in the gray suit. Their exchange was brief, but the manager's eyebrows lifted in surprise. He began to look over at Evelyn's table with a solemn expression. Once they finished, the man in the suit returned to his seat, picking up his water glass as though nothing unusual had occurred. Yet there was a quiet tension in the air, like the deep breath before a thunderclap. Emily, meanwhile, was in a far corner, restocking drinkware with trembling hands. She struggled to swallow the acidic mix of humiliation and anger that threatened to roil over. Part of her wanted to confront Evelyn to defend herself, but she knew it would likely end badly. Instead, she stared at the row of glasses, gathering her courage to keep going. One table at a time, she reminded herself. One more hour, then another. One more shift, then she could go home and try to forget. Little did she know, fate had other plans for how this night would end. Not long after, Evelyn requested the check, eager to continue her evening elsewhere. She waved Emily over with a dramatic flick of her fingers, but instead of Emily, the manager arrived at her table, with Emily following carefully behind. He held a tray with a bottle of chilled champagne and a sealed envelope. Evelyn arched an eyebrow, her lips curving into a smug, expectant grin. "Compliments of the house," the manager said formally. One of Evelyn's friends let out a delighted squeal, and another clapped her hands. "Well, it's about time someone here acknowledged their premier patrons," Evelyn remarked, casting a cold glance in Emily's direction. But the manager wasn't finished. "This gesture comes directly from the owner of Donovan's," he explained, placing the envelope on the table before Evelyn. "He's been observing your experience tonight and would like to address it personally." Evelyn's triumphant smile flickered with confusion. "The owner," she repeated, her voice rising a half octave. Before the manager could clarify, the man in the gray suit appeared at the table, as though summoned by the mention of his title. Conversations around the room fell silent, forks resting on plates, eyes gravitating toward the unfolding scene. He carried himself with an air of calm authority, his hands loosely clasped in front of him. "Yes, the owner," he said, his tone measured yet firm. "My name is Charles Donovan, and this restaurant belongs to my family. I've been overseeing its operation for years." A flush crept up Evelyn's neck, her earlier dominance wavering. "I didn't realize," she trailed off, words tangling in her throat. Charles offered a polite smile that didn't quite touch his eyes. "I understand you've had some concerns about our service." He gestured to Emily, who stood quietly to the side, her gaze lowered. "What you may not know is that Emily is my niece. She's been working here part-time while saving up for college, and she puts in more hours than anyone else on my team." A murmur of surprise rippled through the tables nearby. Evelyn's friends exchanged uneasy looks, and the color began to drain from Evelyn's cheeks. Charles continued, his voice carrying a quiet power that commanded attention. "I overheard the manner in which you spoke to her tonight. While I accept that mistakes can happen, there is, in my view, a better way to approach them, one grounded in civility and respect." Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, but found no words that felt adequate. She could sense the shift in the atmosphere. All eyes were on her, and the sudden loss of control was unnerving. Charles leaned in, locking eyes with Evelyn, his tone unyielding. "Money might buy you luxury, Mrs. Monroe, but it doesn't entitle you to humiliate those who make that luxury possible." An almost electric hush took over the restaurant. Even the guests who had been trying to remain discreet in their curiosity now openly stared. The tension was thick, and Evelyn's once flawless composure cracked like porcelain under strain. Her fingers curled around the edge of the tablecloth, trembling slightly. One of her friends attempted a weak defense. "I'm sure Evelyn didn't mean any harm," but her voice barely rose above a whisper. Charles shook his head, still focused on Evelyn. Whether she meant harm or not isn't the point. Words leave marks that don't show on the surface. He directed his attention to Emily. "Emily, you showed dignity under pressure tonight. You apologized, you tried to correct the issue, and you remained professional despite the insults. That says more about your character than any critique of your performance." Emily blinked back tears, unable to fully hide her mixture of gratitude and lingering hurt. The patrons who'd witnessed the earlier exchange gave small nods of encouragement. Feeling the momentum of the moment shift, Charles straightened. "Now, concerning this bottle of champagne and the cost of your entire meal, I'm taking the liberty of donating their value to a local charity that empowers young women, women like Emily, who work tirelessly to build brighter futures for themselves. It will be done in your name, Mrs. Monroe. Consider it an invitation to reflect on how we can all use our resources for good." A chorus of murmurs swept through the diners, some offering subdued applause, others exchanging meaningful glances. Evelyn, usually so poised, stared at the envelope on the table as though it might burst into flames. Her face was taut with humiliation. She stammered softly, I didn't mean for things to get so out of hand. I was just," but the weight of her earlier words hung heavily in the air, refusing to fade with a simple apology. Charles took a step back, his gaze drifting across the room, making eye contact with various patrons. "I hope tonight serves as a reminder that kindness costs nothing but can mean everything. You never truly know the burdens people carry, nor do you know who's paying attention. I like to think we can all leave here a little more mindful than when we walked in." The room burst into gentle applause then, a heartfelt acknowledgement of the lesson. No one was cheering Evelyn's embarrassment. Rather, they were applauding the principle behind Charles's words and his defense of the dignity of his staff. Turning back to Emily, Charles spoke gently. "Emily, take 10 minutes if you need. Get some water and clear your head. You've earned a break." Emily nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She hurried toward the back of the restaurant, her posture straighter than before, buoyed by a sense of validation she never expected to receive in such a public forum. The seeds of newfound confidence began to sprout in her heart. Meanwhile, the night resumed its course, but an undeniable shift had occurred. Soft conversations flickered back to life, but the undercurrent of what had just transpired remained. The managers circled the room, offering smiles and brief chats, reassuring patrons that everything was in order. Many responded with supportive nods, some even asking how they could further show appreciation to the staff. The staff, for their part, seemed to move with renewed energy, as though the solidarity shown by their employer had ignited a spark of pride in their work. Evelyn and her friends remained seated, though their meals were mostly untouched. The silence at their table spoke louder than any of Evelyn's previous tirades. She sat still, her gaze unfocused, replaying Charles's words in her mind. "Money might buy you luxury, but it doesn't entitle you." Her cheeks still burned with the sting of being rebuked in front of an audience. No one there pitied her. Rather, they seemed united in quiet respect for the staff and for Charles Donovan, the unassuming man who had gently but firmly drawn a line. In the back of the restaurant, near the clanging bustle of the kitchen, Emily leaned against a stainless steel counter, taking slow breaths to steady herself. The manager approached, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You all right?" he asked kindly. Emily managed a small smile, nodding. "I will be," she said softly. She glanced down at her shoes, then back up at the manager. "I didn't think anyone noticed, or that anyone would stand up for me like that." The manager offered a reassuring grin. "We notice a lot more than you realize." "And Mr. Donovan? He's always been fair, but tonight, well, that was something special." Emily swallowed, feeling a surge of gratitude for Charles's intervention. Despite the sting of being publicly demeaned, she felt an odd sense of closure she had never gotten with previous rude customers. Back in the dining area, Charles returned to his seat, sipping from a glass of water in a measured way that belied the gravity of what had just happened. As patrons finished their meals, several paused to speak with him on their way out. One older gentleman, dapper in a tweed suit, stopped to shake Charles's hand. "I want to commend you," he said. "Most restaurant owners would avoid confrontation with wealthy customers. You did the right thing." Charles accepted the handshake, offering a faint yet warm smile. "It wasn't about confrontation. It was about compassion and accountability," he replied quietly. Eventually, Evelyn and her friends rose from their seats. She kept her head lowered, a stark contrast to the proud tilt of her chin when she'd first arrived. Her friends looked equally chastened, shifting from foot to foot as if unsure how to navigate the situation. They left a payment for the meal, though Charles had already stated it would be redirected, and made their way to the exit in near silence. At the door, Evelyn paused, her hand resting on the ornate handle. She cast one last glance around the dining room where she had once held court. This time, the eyes that met hers were not mocking or cruel, they were simply watchful, as though awaiting her next move. She lowered her gaze and stepped outside. Outside, the night air was cool, a gentle breeze whispering through the rows of palm trees that lined the street. Evelyn's friends tried to offer comforting words. "Don't let it get to you," or "it was just a misunderstanding." But she waved them off, needing a moment to absorb the gravity of what had happened. The distant glow of city lights and the sound of passing cars provided a curious counterpoint to the drama that had just unfolded inside Donovan's. Inside, Emily returned to the dining room after her brief reprieve, her shoulders noticeably more relaxed. She felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted from her heart. The subtle nods of respect from a few patrons who caught her eye further bolstered her spirits. She resumed her duties, refilling water glasses and delivering checks with a renewed sense of confidence that had been elusive earlier in the evening. As the last of the guests filtered out, Charles remained seated near the window, his gaze fixed on the night sky. He seemed deep in thought, perhaps reflecting on how quickly an ordinary evening could turn extraordinary, how small acts of kindness or cruelty could shape someone's entire experience. When the doors finally closed, the staff began the nightly ritual of cleaning up, collecting half-empty wine glasses, wiping down tables, and rolling silverware. Emily quietly helped the other waiters, smiling more than she had at the start of her shift. The tension that had weighed on her so heavily was replaced by something new, a sense of belonging and safety. She had seen someone in power use his position not to enable cruelty, but to stop it in its tracks. Looking through the glass, Charles watched as the last pair of patrons stepped onto the sidewalk and disappeared into the soft glow of street lamps. A faint smile tugged at his lips. He had not raised his voice, nor had he aimed to humiliate Evelyn. He simply wanted to illustrate an often overlooked truth. If wealth and status were used as a shield to degrade or harm others, they ultimately lost their value. But if used to uplift and empower, they became meaningful. It was a lesson he hoped would linger not just with Evelyn, but with everyone who witnessed the incident. The staff wrapped up their closing duties with a quiet camaraderie, aware that the events of the night were more than just a spectacle. The hush in the restaurant felt peaceful, as if the building itself were settling into a gentle slumber. Emily wiped down a table and paused, remembering the look on Evelyn's face when Charles introduced himself. The abrupt shift in power dynamics had been jarring, but it proved a powerful lesson. Even those deemed invisible had protectors, and some watchers had more influence than the loudest voice in the room. It was nearly midnight when Emily finally shed her apron and slipped on her jacket. The manager thanked her for her hard work, offering a sympathetic nod. She glanced one more time at the dimly lit dining area, feeling a soft warmth in her chest, a newfound respect for the place she worked. Under different circumstances, she might have left carrying only humiliation, but Charles's calm confrontation had turned a painful moment into something transformative. Emily stepped into the crisp air of the San Diego night, grateful that she was leaving not with anger, but with hope. Soon after, Charles took one last leisurely walk through the restaurant, ensuring everything was prepared for the next day. He ran a hand along the edges of a table, checked that the wine racks were locked, and smiled at the quiet hum of the refrigeration units in the bar area. Before locking up, he paused by the large windows overlooking the gently lit street. The evening's events replayed in his mind, and he felt a quiet satisfaction in having stood up for Emily, and by extension, for all who worked tirelessly without applause. He knew not everyone would approve of his decision. Some might argue a business owner should never risk upsetting high-paying customers. But Charles believed in a different kind of wealth, one measured in integrity and respect. Finally, he turned off the last of the lights and stepped outside into the cool San Diego air. The moon hung low over the skyline, and the ocean's distant presence kissed the breeze with salt. Maybe Evelyn would remember his words the next time she felt the urge to belittle someone. Maybe the patrons who applauded would consider their own words more carefully in the future. And maybe Emily and others like her would feel just a bit more confident, knowing that someone cared enough to protect their dignity. After all, the subtle interplay of kindness and accountability had the power to echo far beyond any single night's events. As you reflect on this story, remember that how we treat others, especially those in positions of service, reveals our deepest values. Yes, money can buy luxury, but cannot purchase the right to trample on someone's spirit without consequence. We all have the choice, day by day, encounter by encounter, to lift someone up instead of tearing them down. And often, it is in those small, seemingly insignificant moments that we discover the core of who we really are. If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need a reminder of the profound power of empathy and respect. And don't forget to subscribe for more narratives that encourage us to treat one another with humanity, decency, and an open heart. Because in a world that often rewards the loudest voices and the flashiest shows of wealth, there is still immeasurable value in quiet acts of compassion, and in owners like Charles Donovan, who remember that people matter more than profits.